November 9th, 1989. East Berlin, 6:53 in the evening. A tired, unprepared Communist Party official named Gunther Schabowski walked up to a podium at a routine press conference and pulled a crumpled note from his pocket. The note described a new government policy that would allow East Germans to apply for permission to travel to the West. The policy was meant to take effect the following morning, after border guards had been briefed and passport procedures had been established. Schabowski had received the note just minutes before the conference began. He had not read it carefully. Nobody had told him about the delay. An Italian journalist in the back of the room raised his hand. "When does this take effect?" Schabowski hesitated. He looked down at the note. It said nothing about timing. He improvised. "As far as I know," he said, "immediately, without delay." 3 words in German, ab sofort, unverzüglich. Within hours, hundreds of thousands of people were pressing against the Berlin Wall from both sides. The border guards, who had received no new orders whatsoever, had no idea what to do. At 9:20 that night, the guard at the Bornholmer Strasse checkpoint, overwhelmed by the crowd, simply opened the gate. People flooded through. Within hours, the most powerful symbol of the Cold War was being torn apart by ordinary people with hammers and their bare hands. One man's unrehearsed answer to one reporter's question ended the division of Europe. But what if Schabowski had read the note more carefully? What if he had said, "tomorrow morning," instead of "immediately"? What if the crowds had not gathered, the guards had not been overwhelmed, and the wall had stood one more day, giving the government time to reimpose control and pull back from the brink? Historian Frederick Taylor, one of the foremost experts on modern German history, addressed this question directly. He was unambiguous. A Berlin Wall that did not fall in 1989, he argued, would have required massive repression to maintain. The pressure was too great, the desire for freedom too powerful, the economic system too broken to sustain itself without force. East Germany, by the late 1980s, was borrowing heavily from West Germany, just to keep its shelves stocked. The regime that built the wall to stop its own population from leaving had become dependent on the country it was walled off from to survive. What a continued wall means, Taylor said, is something not dissimilar to North Korea. An isolated, militarized, economically stagnant state, held together not by belief, but by guns, a place where people queue for basic goods, live under constant surveillance, and understand that the price of dissent is imprisonment or death. The East Germans who went to the wall on November 9th, 1989, were not revolutionaries with a plan. They were ordinary people, factory workers, teachers, young parents with children who had been watching their neighbors flee through Hungary all summer, who had been gathering in Leipzig every Monday for weeks, demanding change, who had reached the point where they were simply no longer willing to be afraid. If the wall had held that night, those people go home. Some are arrested. The protest movement, deprived of its breakthrough moment, either is crushed or goes underground. The hardliners in the East German Politburo, who had wanted to use force all along, argue that they have been proven right. The reformers are silenced. And here is where the alternate history becomes genuinely global in its consequences. The Berlin Wall did not fall in isolation. It fell as part of a cascade. Within weeks of that November night, Czechoslovakia's communist government collapsed in the Velvet Revolution. Romania's dictator Nicolae Ceausescu was captured and executed on Christmas Day. Poland had already held its first partially free elections in June. Hungary had already opened its border with Austria. The entire Eastern Bloc, which had been held together partly by the assumption that Moscow would send tanks, if necessary, was discovering that Gorbachev had decided not to send tanks. The fall of the wall was not the cause of all this. It was the most dramatic symbol of a wave that was already moving, but it was also an accelerant. Each country watching East Germans stream through checkpoints understood that the system could be challenged. A wall that holds on November 9th slows that cascade. It does not necessarily stop it. The underlying forces are too powerful. But it delays it, perhaps by months, perhaps by years. And in politics, timing is everything. A slower, more controlled collapse of the Eastern Bloc, one that happens through negotiation rather than through spontaneous crowds at checkpoints, might have produced very different outcomes. German reunification, which happened with extraordinary speed in 1990, largely because the wall's fall created political momentum that neither side could control, might have been a decade-long negotiation instead. The Soviet Union, which collapsed in 1991 partly because the failure of its European empire delegitimized the entire project, might have had more time to attempt the kind of managed reform that Gorbachev was trying to achieve. A Soviet Union that survives into the mid-1990s as a reformed but intact state, rather than collapsing suddenly and catastrophically, produces a very different Russia than the one that emerged from the chaos of 1991. The Russia that exists today, its politics, its resentments, its relationship with NATO, its decision to invade Ukraine is shaped fundamentally by the experience of sudden, humiliating collapse in 1991. The oligarchs who seized state assets in the chaos of the 1990s, the economic devastation that pushed life expectancy down and crime up, the political vacuum that eventually a figure like Vladimir Putin filled all of this flows from the speed and completeness of the Soviet collapse. A slower, more managed transition might have produced a Russia that feels less robbed of its history and less determined to claw back what it lost. There is no Ukraine war in a world where the Soviet collapse was managed rather than chaotic. There may be no Putin at all, at least not Putin as we know him. But there is also no free Poland, no free Czech Republic, no free Hungary or Romania or the Baltic states. The people of those countries, who spent the entire Cold War dreaming of the night they could make their own choices about their own futures, wait longer, maybe much longer, for that morning to arrive. In a world where the wall holds, the people of Warsaw and Prague and Tallinn and Riga go to bed on November 10th, 1989, in a continent that is still divided, still controlled, still watched. There is one more dimension to this alternate history that reaches directly into the present. The European Union as it exists today, the world's largest single market, the most ambitious experiment in voluntary political and economic integration in human history, was built on the assumption that the Cold War was over, that European borders were settled, and that the nations of the continent could gradually integrate their economies and eventually their politics in a shared project. The EU's eastward expansion, which brought in Poland, the Czech Republic, Hungary, Slovakia, the Baltic states, Romania, Bulgaria, and others, was possible only because those countries were free to choose it. A Europe in which the wall never fell is a Europe in which none of that expansion happens. The EU remains a Western European club, richer but smaller, and the question of what to do about the countries on the other side of the wall is never resolved. Schabowski later said, "It was a fatal mistake to think that we could reorganize the GDR by opening the wall after 28 years. On August 13, 1961, we erected the wall to protect the GDR. On November 9, 1989, we started knocking the wall down to rescue the GDR. It was two contrary propositions, but for the same purpose. Both failed. He was right that both failed. What he could not have known, standing at that podium with his crumpled note, was that his improvised answer to one reporter's question would do more to reshape the map of the world than any policy decision any government had made in decades. 3 words. A moment's hesitation. The course of history changed by a man who had not read the memo he was supposed to be announcing. If the Berlin Wall had never fallen, do you think the world would be more stable or less stable today? Drop your answer below.